All right. So we are at theme number 6, adjustments to emancipation, 1838 to 1876. And we are upon the first objective, which says identify the problems affecting the sugar industry in the English speaking Caribbean between 1838 and 1854. If we look at the content for this first objective, then we will see a list of the, the problems that affected the British Caribbean sugar industry. Now, here are the problems. 1, labor. 2, capital. 3, technology. And 4, free trade. Free trade. All right. So we realize that on August 1, 1838, by act of the British Parliament, all enslaved Africans, all apprentices were now free, right? Freedom meant that they could leave the plantation, that they were no longer restricted in terms of staying and working for the whites. What this did is that it drove the laborers off the plantation. So you found that many Africans, they decided that they wanted to leave the plantation system because the plantation reminded them a lot, so much so, reminded them so much of their life as a slave. So they decided that they needed to leave. Now, Doris Hamilton Willie puts it like this: the major problems faced by the sugar planters during the first few years after emancipation, in her book, Adjustments to the Problems of Emancipation, Lest You Forget. In all seasons, the shortage, the irregularity of estate labor was a chronic problem for planters in the larger territories. The busiest time for those ex-slaves who cultivated provision grounds coincided with crop time on the estate. This forced the ex-slaves to choose between their own and their employers' crops. And quite naturally, they chose their own. So, for those laborers who decided to remain on the plantations, we found that they, as a part of the agreement, a part of the arrangement, they would continue to work for the whites, and they would also get the opportunity to keep their provision grounds, right? And also for those who worked part time on the estates and had their farms off site, so off the plantation, then when it came time now for reaping, instead of focusing on the planters' crops, especially for those who cultivated sugarcane as ex slaves, right? They focused on harvesting their crop rather than trying to work for their masters. So, in terms of trying to get a number of ex slaves to work during harvesting time, it was not very successful on the part of the planters because, of course, the ex slaves now had their own crops to tend to, and they chose to tend to their own crops rather than um, working for the whites, which made sense. The planters' lack of capital. So we come into the lack of capital shortly. But just a few other instances on labor. We realize that a lot of the newly ex-slaves, instead of continuing on the plantations, they migrated in droves So they left the plantation, especially in an area like Jamaica, which had a lot of mountainous areas. We found that ex-slaves, they moved away from the plantation system and they began to squat in the mountainous areas in Jamaica, where they established settlements. Um, in terms of crown land, so they squatted on crown land, but it was difficult for the government now to ensure or to enforce the rules or the laws concerning squatting, because of course Jamaica being so hilly and in terms of the terrain, it was difficult for the few soldiers in Jamaica to man and to ensure that the slaves, they were not found squatting on land. And of course, we have strength in numbers. So where large droves of ex-slaves decided to squat, the few soldiers were pretty much never made any sense they go and try to enforce any rule or any law as it relates to that. Now, in smaller areas like Barbados, we found that skilled workers from Jamaica and other areas in the Caribbean, they made their way to Barbados because, of course, the price of land, not the price of land, I'm thinking of the sugar revolution there. The price of labor, the cost of labor was higher. So laborers in Barbados were paid higher wages than anywhere else in the Caribbean. And we know that Barbados, because of its flat land, had a huge number of plantations. So there was a chronic labor problem that started to develop in the Caribbean area. And the slaves, the the ex-slaves, many of them refused to continue working, to refuse to continue their association with plantation life. And as a result, we found that the plantations began to suffer. The sugar industry itself began to suffer. When we were looking at the sugar revolution, we recognized that the most critical starting point in terms of creating an economy for the production of sugar would have been the factors of production, mainly land, labor, and capital. Now that the bulk of the laborers were no longer willing to work on the plantation, then this posed a severe challenge for the sugar industry. All right. Then we have the idea of capital. One of the things about capital is that being that it is now 1838, the British government was now transitioning, and the whole British economy was now transitioning from focusing on plantation labor and a dependency on plantation labor to now focusing on what we would call industrialization. So Britain was now benefiting heavily from the industrial revolution which was taking place. So their dependency on Caribbean sugar was now um, threatened, was now getting a bit weary, because of course when we come to the next point, we realize that the planters, they were unwilling to embrace the mechanization, unwilling to embrace technology. So we found it now that the industrialists, right, in terms of the development of um, new manufactured goods, that is what the economy's focus was now on, right? The development of iron ore, the development of steam power, the development of coal mines. So most of the funding that was supposed to be pumped into the Caribbean, into the sugar industry, they started now to divert into these other areas, right? So the British Caribbean sugar industry started to get competition from these other areas. So as a result, there was limited amount of capital. And of course, we will look later on at the fact now that Cuban sugar was developing and becoming a lot more significant in terms of quality and um, price than that of the British Caribbean sugar. So capital, there was limited amount of investors. And of course, even though sugar was profitable, we didn't see a lot of persons willing to take the risk to invest in an area where the laborers were not present. So you have a labor problem. Why would I want to invest in your business if your business is dependent on laborers and you have no laborers? Right? So that was a severe problem. If we look at the whole idea of technology, the British industrialist, as of course it's the industrial age, starting in 1750, going into now the 19th century. And we realize that still the British Caribbean sugar planters, they did not want to embrace mechanization. They did not want to embrace the technology. Other areas in the Caribbean had embraced it in terms of like the Spanish Caribbean. So Cuba, they started mechanization. Some of the French territories started mechanization. But the British planters, they say, we have our slaves. The slaves are working fine. So we do not need to go full scale industrialization. So they did not introduce the vacuum pans. They did not introduce the harvesters for the cane. So they were in a state of technological backwardness. And of course, the fact that they refused to embrace the technology, that also meant that investors were driven away from them, right? So that's the whole idea of technology. Let's hear what Doris Hamilton Willie has to say. Planters lacked capital and cash with which to pay wages and to invest in labor saving technology. Under slavery, currencies in the territories, particularly smaller denominations, were in short supply as, as much trading was conducted on a better basis, on a barter basis, or their European trading partners paid planters in credit or supplies. Almost all the European countries with possessions in the West Indies and the independent mainland states had coins which circulated in the islands, but supplies were never sufficient. The coins included the United States dollars, reals, escudos, and guilders. All right. So also now she says that there was a high cost of production, particularly in the territories where there was accessible fertile land that could allow the ex-slaves to exist independently of the estates. Wages were generally higher in these territories. And we realize that was mentioned earlier. So we realize that the British Caribbean planters, they were unwilling to turn to technology, and that had a significant ramification on the industry between the period 1838 to 1875. Now, we're going to turn to see the main point or the main consequence of the British move to liberate the slaves. This consequence was that it led to the collapse of the industry, the British Caribbean sugar industry. It began to decline significantly, so much so that the British government now decided to turn their back on the sugar that was produced in their own territory. What did they do? In 1846, the British government introduced what is described as the Sugar Duties Equalization Act. The Sugar Duties Equalization Act. So what they were essentially doing, they were allowing all Caribbean planters, whether British, French, or Spanish, to have a free reign in terms of being able now to sell their sugar on the British market. Previously, what happened is that the British government had what is described as preferential treatment for sugar coming from their territories. They had what is described as preferential treatment, preference. Yes? So because you are a colony of mine, I will allow you to send your sugar to me, right? So you will send the sugar from Jamaica, from Barbados, from all over the different British Caribbean islands into the British market, and the British government would ensure that your sugar got a sale, right? So it would be preference, first preference for me. Now, what happened to the other sugars coming in from the French and the Spanish is that those would be sold at a higher price, much, much higher price, which made it definitely what we'd say unaffordable for those persons in Britain. So they would ensure that the sugar was sold, all British sugar was sold, right? And also, right, they would ensure that the sugars coming from the different areas in the Caribbean, right? So the French islands, the Spanish islands, that those would not flood the market to the point where it would take over and become the main um, suppliers of sugar in the British market. But in 1846, the government decided that, hey, we are no longer going to support this standard of preference. We are going to allow all sugar to be equally distributed. Same price, same markets, same competition. So everybody was now on equal footing. So this also now created a problem, a severe problem for the British Caribbean planters, because they now had to be competing with the higher quality sugar of Cuba, of the United States, right? And of other areas within the Caribbean. So that's basically what objective one um, speaks of. Any questions on that? Any observations? All right, let's go to objective two. All right, so objective two asks us now to describe the attitudes of the labor in the English speaking Caribbean after 1838. So, what was the attitude to labor? So, we of course have to establish who is this objective referring to. Is it referring to the slaves only, or is it the, well, not the slaves, the ex-slaves only, or is it referring to the planters and the ex-slaves? Share your thoughts. What do you think?
So I think it would refer to both, um,
All right.
in the sense that the the landowners, the planters, they would have to adjust to the idea of putting resources in place to pay people to work. They didn't have the luxury of having slaves that gave them free labor, so they had to probably rework their whole accounting and how they distribute their already limited funds. Uh, the slaves or the ex-slaves, uh, it would be a welcome change for them to not be under slavery and to work freely, so they'd have to get used to the fact that nobody would be running behind them to do such and such. So they'd have to take their own initiative to complete work. Those are my viewpoints.
All right. Excellent points indeed. Now, so we have the planter's view and we have the view, the views expressed by the ex-slave. Now, Doris Hamilton, in terms of what she has to say. So she says, persons concerned with getting labor for the sugar estates after emancipation. Because of course you had some persons who, yeah, they wanted to get labor. One, planters in the West Indies, right? So they wanted to get labor for the estates. Two, the local governments. Three, the government in Britain. Four, members of the West India interests. So the planters' representatives in Britain, right? Five, officials at the colonial office. All realized that a constant supply of cheap labor was necessary for sugar production to be profitable in the West Indies, right? For this reason, after emancipation, the British government provided loans for the colonies to import workers from overseas. So if we look at the attitudes of individuals towards labor in the British speaking Caribbean, we realize that everybody recognized the important need for laborers, especially those when we look at the whites. They recognized that they needed laborers. As a result, they turned to immigration, which we will look at later on. So, what methods did the planters actually use to get laborers in the initial phases, right? So initially, planters tried to use coercion to maintain adequate supply of laborers. They tried to make it difficult for the ex-slaves to obtain land and to find alternative means of survival away from the estates, thus forcing them to remain. So if we are looking at the description of the attitudes to labor, we recognize that the planters, they realized that laborers were so important that they could not afford to give the laborers the opportunity or the option to go and establish themselves outside of the plantation. So we will realize that the planters made it very, very difficult for the ex-slaves to acquire land outside of the estates. One of the things that they did is that they sold the land at a higher price. And in many instances, they refused to sell ex-slaves small portions of land. So if you're going to buy land, you would have to buy a large portion of land And that would not work at all. Because, of course, as an ex slave coming out of apprenticeship, the a limited number of funding that you would have, of course, wouldn't be sufficient for you to make that sort of a purchase, right? Let's look at another one. They provided incentives for the ex slaves to remain. For example, they allowed them to continue to use the cottages and their provision grounds. So they are saying, all right, here is what is going to happen. We recognize that you need a place to sleep because, most importantly, in after 1838, as of August 1, 1838, if you decided to leave the estate as an ex-slave, you had literally no place to sleep. Yeah? As in you did not have a house. Right? So the majority of the ex-slaves, once they left the plantations, they had no place to sleep. So planters, of course, being smart now, they say, here is what is going to happen. I will allow you to continue to stay in your slave quarters, right? And of course, you can't call it slave quarters anymore, right? And I'm going to give you an additional option of continuing to work on your provision ground. All you have to do now is to supply me with your labor. So the planters tried that. In Trinidad and in British Guyana, as well as in some other territories, planters offered higher wages during crop time because, of course, they can't allow the crops to spoil, right? So they would have to now say, all right, if they used to pay £10 during crop season, when crop season come now, they would have to increase so to attract more laborers. As we mentioned earlier, that the ex-slaves, instead of focusing on the crops that were produced for the planters, they decided that they would focus on their own crops because that was their attitude. They were not so much inclined to helping the plantation owners. So the plantation owners had to come up with their own strategies to ensure that their crops did not go to waste, did not spoil. All right. They introduced the metayage system. That is metayage, the metayage system. metayage. This is known by another name, the sharecropping system. Now, this system was introduced particularly in Trinidad, well, not Trinidad, but rather Tobago, and also St. Lucia. The planter supplied the land. Naturally, the planters, they are the ones who own the land. So they supply the land, they supply the equipment, right? For sugar manufacture, they supply the carts, they supply the horses, and the laborer supplied the labor, right, in the field and in the factory. So the ex-slaves were the ones who were required to supply their labor, right, while the farmer, while the planters, they supplied the tools necessary to complete the transaction, right? Now, I work for you, you supply the means of the production, excepting for the labor. So you supply the capital and I provide the workmanship, right? Now, when it is crop time and the harvesting is done and the selling is done, what will happen is that I will receive a share of the earnings. That is how it works. So it's sharecropping, right? There are instances, however, where not all plantations were equipped with manufacturing technology, right? So, of course, at the time of the harvest, the planters would then say to the ex-slaves that I will now purchase from you your half of the crop. Yes? But of course, seeing that the ex-slaves did not have the technology or the know-how to do the processing of the sugar cane, of the cane, then of course the planters robbed the ex-slaves. So if the total earnings for the crop equated to, let's say, 100 pounds, that means that the ex slave should get 50 pounds, right? The master would say, the planter would say, all right, you cannot do the manufacturing because you don't have the equipment. So here what you're going to have to do. You are going to pay me a share of your crop so that I can manufacture it for you, right? And then at the end of the whole 100 pound, the ex-slave would maybe end up with 10 or 20 pounds. So they were always abusive in this sharecropping arrangement, simply because the ex-slaves did not have a great say in terms of the production aspect of the process, right? Because of course, sugar, once you cut it, after a while it goes bad. It's no good after a while. So it's crop time, crop has to be harvested, an agreement has to be reached. The ex-slave cannot decide that they're going whole hard in, because of course if they do that, they're going to be losing money. For each day that the crop spends matured in the field, they are going to be losing money. And the planters played this to their advantage beautifully, I might add. That sound a bit wicked, but yeah. So that's how that part of it works. So we've been looking at the attitudes of the planters, and we realized that their attitude was one of trying to recover their laborers. They recognized that the laborers were going to leave, so they tried everything within their power to ensure that the laborers stayed. Coercion, raising the prices, offering incentives, and also we will look at the whole idea of importation of slaves from overseas in a few. Any observations, any comments at this time? We'll take them.
Sir, sir.
Yes, go ahead. We're waiting for the comments.
Sir, I was asking, some slaves were smart. Didn't any one of them realize what was happening?
All right, speak up. I can't hear you. So you say some slaves were smart.
Didn't any one of them realize what's happening and talk to the other slaves about it?
All right, so remember now we are outside of the period where we are looking at slaves. They are no longer any slaves. So they are ex-slaves. All right. So we are looking at the ex-slaves now. So of course, many of them realized what was taking place, but they didn't really have a choice. It would be like um the decision that they made, they basically decided to stick with it. Because, of course, for many of them, the plantation was the only life that they knew. So they just continued to work with it. And of course, the fact is this, that they had their own side hustle. So even though they were doing the metayage system, right, they still had their own. side hustle. They still had their provision grounds or their little farms, wherever the farms were, whether on the estates or off the estate. So that was it. So it's not so much that they didn't realize. They did, and for some, they may have moved on, but of course, we realize that some were pretty much trapped in the culture of the plantation, wherewith they decided that it would have been better to remain in something that is sure than to go on to something which they were unsure of. Because essentially, the plantation was sure. So they were sure of their bread, they were sure of their food. What going off the plantation was severe uncertainty. They were basically going into an area now which that they were very much unfamiliar with, right? So for some, well, as we we come to looking at the next area, which is the attitude of the ex-slaves. So for some, as I said, some the plantation was the only life that they knew. So they just continued to work with it. They decided that this is what I know, so I'm just going to continue to work with it. And of course, we realized that because many of them had not spent a long time in slavery, then it was okay for them. For others, they would not have experienced the horrors that many other slaves would have experienced. So they continued. So it depends on the state of mind of where your state of mind is in terms of what you thought about the situation. Because of course, for some slaves, for some ex-slaves, they felt that, hey, I am not going to spend another day on the plantation. So as of August 1, 1838, a huge majority of them decided to leave the plantation. A huge majority of them, they just upped and left. And even those who left, they they left, but they still returned. The planters, in fact, encouraged the squatting of slaves close to the plantation area. So if we look in areas, we look in St. Elizabeth at Appleton, we'll find that there are a number of communities which have developed in and around the area of the sugar estate in Appleton, St. Elizabeth, Jamaica. Right? So that
Sir, I
is
have
what
a
happened.
question.
Yes, go ahead with your question.
Sir, the houses that are near the factory, sir, were there like the house where the children live.
All
Sir,
right, those are the houses that are on the plantation or the ones that are close to the factory as it exists today.
both, sir.
No, I wouldn't look at it like that because of course we realize that the slaves in terms of where they were situated on the plantation, it was strategic, right? So in terms of looking at the location of Appleton, I would have to actually um, have a map or go there physically to determine if where the houses are now, that is where the slaves actually resided. So I wouldn't be able to say definitively that that was so. All right. But we realize that in that general area of Appleton, that we have a number of communities um, which developed because of the existence of the plantation area there, right? So we found that some ex-slaves, they left the plantation, but they stayed close enough so they could go back to the plantation to acquire work. We had some ex-slaves who they decided that we are not going to leave the plantation, we are going to stay and continue working. And then we had those ex-slaves who decided that, hey, I am not staying anywhere near here. I am going far away from the plantation. And then they established their settlements in remote areas of the country. And if we look at an example like Manchester, which would be an area where no plantation was, we'll see how, in terms of how we have developed and how we have evolved, coming out of the plantation system. Even though we had, um, we wouldn't necessarily say plantations here, but well, no sugar plantations, but like coffee, um, and also cattle. We know that Manchester High School um, was an area that was used for rearing cattle, right? At the third farm block, that is where they used to keep a lot of the cows and so on, right? So if we look at it now, we will realize that in terms of the attitude of the ex-slaves, so some decided that, hey, we are going to continue to work on the plantations. Others decided that, hey, we are going to leave the plantation, but we are going to squat. We are going to live close enough so that we can get work. The others, they decided that, hey, we are not going to stay anywhere close to here, any at all. So they set up remote villages far away from the plantation. And then you had those persons who um, decided that we are not so much going to um, develop any permanent residence of sorts. We are just going to move from town to town, from plantation to plantation, looking jobs. So we had a group of individuals who decided that we are just going to go wherever the work is, right? So they moved from place to place. So they moved from plantation to plantation, from town to town, doing odd jobs here, doing odd jobs there. Once the jobs were finished, they simply just moved on to another area, right? So these were the attitudes of the ex-slaves. Also importantly, some of them, they refused to continue doing any type of farming. They said that they are not going to do any farming. Well, they sought to sell um, manufactured goods. So we found that many of them, they started to develop this entrepreneurial lifestyle where they decided that they would be selling items. So getting produce from the ships and selling some of these manufactured goods coming out of England and the United States. So many of them became what we describe as peddlers, right? Many of them, they went into handicraft. And we look at our Rastafarian culture now, with most of them being very good in terms of carving wood. So many of them went into that area. Many of them became shopkeepers. And we look at how the shopkeeping system has evolved in Jamaica, where every single district in Jamaica has a shop or a few shops, right? We have that. Many of them, they decided to do hustling, so where they would just go and they would start to walk and sell fish, you know. So they go, they catch fish, um or they purchase fish, then they move from community to community, and they're selling their fishes. Many of them, instead of um doing the cultivation, they turned to other occupations, such as becoming longshoremen, so becoming fishermen, becoming porters, going into the towns to become beggars. Yeah, right after 1838 there, we had our first beggars, right? Persons who decided that, hey, we now work. We are gonna just walk around and beg. Not necessarily. Um, they were called vagabonds. So these persons, they refused to work. They lost their interest in working. So they just walk around and beg. Was it productive? Yes, because we see the same thing happening in today's society, where persons refuse to work and they just walk around and beg. All right. So that's objective one and two for today. When we move into the next segment, we will looking at we will be looking at objective three, where we will be establishing now the introduction of immigrants such as which raises the point that one of the attitude to labor was that many of the ex-slaves, instead of staying in the Caribbean, they migrated, they returned home to Africa, and many ended up in the United States and in other territories within the Caribbean, actually, right? So we had the Europeans trying to get Africans, and then after that, they tried to get Europeans to come and work as indentured laborers. And then after the Europeans, they start to get individuals from Madeira, and then after that they tried to introduce the Chinese, and then after the Chinese they came the Indians, and then after the Indians um, came the Syrians and the Lebanese. Right. I'm not so sure which one came first, if it was the Chinese or the Indians, but we will discover that in the next lesson. All right. So for now, peace out.